Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bigfoot Tales. I'm your host, D.L.Soucy, coming to you from the glorious coastline of Maine. And I want to go over a article, a lengthy article actually, from 1908. It's from a book called The Scrapbook. The Scrapbook was a monthly publication, and occasionally they would put out quarterly print collections or anthologies of their stories, and I came across this one. But first, let me go back and do a little bit of a background. There are a lot of you that are just coming on board here, and you're not really sure what I'm all about or where I'm coming from and so on. So we'll go back a little bit, and we'll talk about what my research covers as it pertains to the world of Bigfoot. Number one, I have had sightings of whatever this is. I call it Bigfoot because I can't really come up with a better name for it at the particular time. Eventually, if it is in fact a real wild creature that lives in our forests and haunts our backgrounds of our minds, we will eventually find him, and we will find out what it is. Until then, we're going to be stuck calling it Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, or one of the many other hundreds of names that have been attributed to these wild creatures that have surrounded us for thousands of years now. But my research has led me to believe that a good many sightings of what we call Bigfoot today is actually not of some sort of creature that is cryptozoological in nature, but actually human by way of wild people. And I've touched upon a lot of different things. You'll have to go back through all the videos. There's not time to discuss all of that in this venue here today. But as I look through the stories over the past centuries, it wasn't up until about the time when Rudyard Kipling came up with his Jungle Book stories, and then Edgar Rice Burroughs came along with his Tarzan stories. It wasn't until then that people actually started attributing these wild people as being ape-like. For whatever reason. Part of that reason is because up until the latter 1800s, the reality of anthropomorphic apes didn't come into existence. The gorilla wasn't actually discovered until the 1850s. So, and that was actually generally accepted as being the wild men that Hanno saw back in the olden days of the explorations of Jason and the Argonaut, and that range of the literature. But anyhow, we'll fast forward to 1908, the July through December issues of the Scrapbook out of volume 6 of the bound stories. And we're going to talk about one particular article entitled Romance and Reality of the Wild Man. It's written by Selden Burke. And he subtitled it Amazing Beings Who Lose Their Grip on Civilization and Slip Back into the Lowest Savagery. And this is actually something that we really have to discuss as we have our conversations about Bigfoot and the wild men of the woods and what it is that we're looking for out there. But it is a longer article, so I'm going to get right into it. And perhaps at some other time we'll have I'll have another video addressing this topic, particularly involving this article and many of the different wild men that live out there. And, in fact, in my research, I have actually come across 2 of these hermit people that live out in the woods. And they live on the outskirts of civilization. They rely on civilization for its outcasts, both by way of food and other things. But we'll get into that in a different video. I want to get through this article today so that we can develop a foundation for future discussions. So let's get right into it. The Romance and Reality of the Wild Man. If we can believe Mr. Darwin, we were all once wild men. We wore no clothing, we lived in the woods, we attended no bridge or whist parties, nor gave any. We wouldn't have given the best French chef $3 a week for all the food he could cook. If a Melba or a Tetrazzini had started anything at $5 a seat and upward, we should have let her starve to death. We preferred the music of birds, the lisping of the leaves, the murmur of the waters. That was a million years ago. Most of us have changed a little since then. Homegrown hair suits, rooted in the flesh, are not pictured in the best fashion journals. No gentleman will wear a suit that costs less than $8 if he can help it. And a French chef would have locomotor ataxia in less than a week if he were to cook meals for all who like his goods. Some lost their hold because they lost their minds. Some, perhaps, heard too loudly the call of the wild. Some, maybe, but what's the use of speculating? The wild men are there here, that we know, and that alone. The most recent wild man is said to be living in a cave near Mayanes, Connecticut, and can not only run like a deer, but can swim like a fish. A 14-year-old boy avows that the strange creature made a whistling noise, and a rabbit, held spellbound, was easily captured. The wild boy of Arkansas, who appeared early in the 90s, seems to have vanished, leaving behind nothing save tradition. For 3 or 4 years, people living near Benton reported from time to time seeing a wild man in the woods who would dart away at their approach. It remained for David Williams to tell the most detailed story. It was in March 1892 that he was journeying to Benton when he saw 3 wolves running through the underbrush, and with them a boy about 15 years old. The lad was brown from exposure, and his lithe body was nude, but most surprising was the fact that he traveled on all 4s. The wolves were going on a swift lope, but he apparently experienced no trouble in keeping up with them, running with a peculiar swaying, headlong movement. The hair of his head formed a shaggy mane. At first glance, he might have been mistaken for some wild animal. But David Williams averred that he had ample opportunity to observe the lad, and there was no room for mistake. He also concluded, from the way in which beast and boy were traveling, that the lad was perfectly familiar with the wolves. A family of 4 persons who used no spoken language, but held communication by signs and peculiar sounds, furnishes one of the most interesting incidents in the history of wild humans. The man and woman had no hair on their heads. They had been observed at different periods by hunters and wayfarers, but finally, in the fall of 1886, searching parties started along Carson's Creek, Washington County, Kansas, determined to run down and capture the wild family group. In this they were successful, but could get no information from the captives, who seemed not to understand a single word of the queries directed at them. From the condition of the heads of the man and woman, it was supposed that they had been scalped by Indians many years before and had become insane and wandered in the wilderness ever since. Dressed with Adam-like simplicity, a wild man, his face savagely haloed with a bristly red beard, kept the farmers of Chester, Lancaster, and Bucks counties, Pennsylvania, busy at the chase. He was a husky creature, weighing about 185 pounds. The territory bordering the 3 counties was the theater of his adventures. He haunted the highways at night, and even ventured forth in the daytime, so that women and children fearfully kept indoors. Once he set upon a farmer who possessed objectionable curiosity and severely beat the man. 3 well-organized attempts were made to capture him, but he seemed to have had no trouble in evading his pursuers. In the same year, the people of Alexander, Missouri, had a wild man scare. This neck of the woods was patriarchal, had a shaggy beard, and his eyes rolled wildly in his head. In tatters and moved by frenzy, he made an impressive yet terrifying figure. He was believed to have been a man who had disappeared from Palmyra, Missouri, years before, who had become insane. 2 weeks later, a mild man appeared in Pennsylvania, this time in the Welsh Mountains near New Holland. He took a savage delight in suddenly appearing and startling both men and women. Then he would dart away laughing in the fashion that made the blood curdle in the veins of those who heard him. In the summer of the following year, a wild man near Woodbury, Long Island, kept the farmers' wives in constant trepidation. He was seldom seen in daylight, but after nightfall foraged in potato fields and gardens. Exceedingly stealthy in his movements and fleet of foot, he long baffled capture. Clad in nondescript rags, with neither hat nor coat nor shoes, he was a fearsome figure in the light of the June moon. When eventually he was captured, he proved to be a demented German. 5 months later, another wild man made his appearance on Long Island. He was first observed in the woods near Mattituck. He also subsisted on potatoes, onions, and poultry. The country community was especially disturbed, for it was feared that the man was an outlaw, probably a murderer who had fled the big cities with the idea of baffling pursuit in the lonely woods of Long Island. A posse, armed and nerved up to the adventure, started to find the midnight raider. This did not appear to be difficult, for though the man had a most savage aspect, he very quietly submitted to capture. He was an insane patient escaped from the Kings County Asylum. He gibbered with delight when a good meal was placed before him. His capture, however, caused great rejoicing in the section. Sometimes the wild man is marked by all of the savage, ruthless instinct of the wild beast, and his very mention brings terror to even the most skeptical of persons. Such was the one reported to be living near Holder's Pond, not far from Lynn, Massachusetts. The community of Pine Hill has cause to remember him, for his chief delight, outside of a slaughter of poultry, seemed to be chasing women and children. Beetle-browed, hairy, and toothed like a boar, so it is said, he tried to reach his victims by coming upon them on his hands and knees, at which method of locomotion he was amazingly adept, moving with incredible swiftness. Once he nearly reached a group of children, but was discovered just in time. The children, shrieking in terror, fled, and as help was soon at hand, the wild man turned and ran away. He was supposed to be an escaped murderer from the jail at Dover, New Hampshire. There is no record of his capture, and it is probable that the hunt for him became so hot and determined that he sought new territory. The amazing supposition in the case of the Arkansas wild people thought to have wandered in the wilderness for many years is matched by a case that came to light in Alabama, wherein the wild man, according to the best authority, lived apart from civilization for 30-odd years. He was a Negro who, in his prime, had undoubtedly been a splendid physical specimen. Even at the age of 60, when he was captured, he was possessed of plenty of vigor. People living in the vicinity of Bruton had caught glimpses of this uncanny figure in the pines, and in short stretches of open country. He was thought, at first, to be a huge ape escaped from some traveling show. With an instinct as keen as that of an animal in detecting approaching danger, the wild man, for a long time, kept away from the hunting parties. He was captured about 10 miles from the town, a pitiable and grotesque human image. He could utter no intelligible word, and acted like a wild beast, being possessed of seizures so passionate and wild that it was necessary to securely chain him. He was hopelessly insane. The strangest part of this incident is that, having absolutely failed to identify him through searching inquiry in the state and into tradition and legal records, it was finally decided that he had been a runaway slave. With no definite plan of destination in mind, and being cut off from civilization, fleeing from the approach of white or black, he held to his haven in the forest, living on roots and nuts, trapping birds in a primitive fashion, and passing speech with no human being until the faculty left him and he became insane, ferocious, and predatory. In the 3 years following January 1894, New Jersey had a remarkable visitation of wild men. The first one was discovered in the woods near Mine Hill, not far from Dover, and the whole town was thrown into a ferment of excitement. 3 girls first saw the creature in the woods, and though the weather was bitterly cold, the man was wholly unclad. His face was covered by a dark black beard, and he carried a rude club. Later, 2 woodchoppers told the story of how hounds cornered a wild man near Indian Falls clearing on the mountain, and how he fearlessly assailed the dogs, laying about him with fierce dexterity, and avoiding the savage onrush of the brutes with almost ape-like agility. The hounds were finally compelled to beat a retreat, and the man fled deeper into the mountain fastness. It was supposed that he made his home in a cave in the mountains, but the most thorough search failed to reveal it. A year later, the housewives of Millville were thrown into a fever of fear by the appearance of a wild figure, which visited several farmhouses and made signs for food. The men of the vicinity armed themselves and kept a keen watch for him, but he did not appear during the daylight hours. As the cold weather increased, the visitations of the wild man became more numerous. He made away with vegetables and poultry. One night, John F. Garretson watched until daylight for his coming. In the meanwhile, the country folk told wonderful stories. Of the doings of that midnight prowler, until he became almost invested with the powers of a supernatural being. Finally, the farmers organized a search, going over every foot of outlying country. They came upon the wild man in the cave and overcame him after a desperate struggle. His strength was that of a maniac, but physically he was in a terrible condition. Investigation showed that he had been driven insane by the loss of his fortune in Indiana and had escaped from an asylum. The next wild man made his retreat quite near a large city, so that it came to pass that Trenton enjoyed something of a manhunt. The fugitive was captured in a dense thicket near the city, and it was learned that for 3 months he had lived in a cave. He also was insane. The time is easily within recall when many of the residents of Upper Montclair, New Jersey, were so terror-stricken that they laid a supply of firearms better to entertain the wild man who visited the neighborhood. This one carried an old, rusty gun and a hickory stick, and though he may have been quite harmless, fear turned him into a formidable object. He was arrested on the complaint of 2 women whom his sudden appearance in a roadway had thrown into hysterics. The judge liberated him on his promise to leave the town. He did so, but took to the woods. Finally, he vanished. The residents of Vineland and Hamilton hunted all during the month of April for a man who was supposed to be a crazy German, but they failed to capture him. In the following August, he appeared in the town of Elm in the same territory. He was seen in the woods by Italian berry pickers, and for a while the gathering of this fruit had considerably fewer workers, especially among the women, who were afraid to go out alone. The hunt was organized, and the man disappeared. In the fall of the same year, a wild man, unclad, wandered for days in the woods near Bonhampton town, and had the whole countryside in terror. Captured, he proved to be insane and was sent to an asylum. In the following month, in South Jersey, hunters came across a man in the woods armed with a dagger and a rusty pistol. He set upon them, and rather than kill him, for he showed no fear of their firearms, they beat a retreat. 2 months later, Mayor Bayless of North Arlington took part in the capture of a wild man in an old copper mine, and the neighborhood bugaboo was sent to an asylum. But the most fearsome creature that New Jersey has ever seen was a giant Negro, all covered with hair, who roamed about Keyport for a while. His introduction to the people of the vicinity was by an attack on 2 muscular and nervy men on the outskirts of town. Though they put up a desperate fight, the Negro proved too much for them, and they fled. Soon afterward, he disappeared. A wild man approached New York as near as Mount Vernon in Bronxville. He was said to have an iron band about his waist, but wore no clothing, and matted hair covered his body. A searching party, made up of men afoot, several mounted on bicycles, a police patrol wagon, and an ambulance, failed to find the man. Though the next day, near Mount Vernon, the king of the road, as he was called, seized a man by the throat. This wild man continued to terrify women and children, and chase men for a week despite the efforts of the police. Then he vanished. Like Nebuchadnezzar, the wild man of Longridge, Connecticut, ate grass, and when first observed, was clad only in a single garment. Captured by the sheriff, he proved to be a demented German from Baden-Baden. The manhunt along the Genesee was attended by something of actual peril, but the quarry in this case was powerful, vicious, and cunning. He lived in a cave near Mount Morris, and the terror in the neighborhood became so great that 50 farmers with a pack of hounds assembled along the river at Horseshoe Falls, determined to round up the wild man. The hounds took up the trail and led the hunters through many twists and turns and doublings into broken country. Then the scent was lost. As the hunters were watching the puzzled dogs, the wild man appeared in the rocks, 75 feet above them. The first intimation of his presence was the crashing of a big boulder that narrowly missed the party. Another and another followed. Then, shrilling his defiance, the wild man vanished. Up in Connecticut, a hideous creature was seen in the woods of Thomas Mountain, and the searchers found his rude shack, put together in the most primitive style. But the wild man was captured by no armed posse. Instead, the superintendent of the poor, a very peaceably inclined man, gathered in the wild man and at once recognized him as a resident of Danbury who had disappeared several months before. He could give no intelligent account of what he had been doing and was committed to the almshouse. Maine once boasted of a small tribe of wild folks, including women. They lived 20 miles north of Skowhegan, near the village of West Athens. 13 years ago, it was said that in all they numbered 40. Rude huts and caves were their habitations, and they were a terror to the country for miles around. Sheep and cattle were stolen from farmers, and wild animals caught in traps furnished them with subsistence. It is said that many of them could not speak any language and held communication only by odd noises and grunts. The men wore practically no clothing. On one occasion, 4 of them were enticed to Norridge Walk and locked up. And that's the end of the article, and we're going to be going over the wild men of Maine in another video at some point down the road. It's a long one that's going to take a lot of work to put together. But it's an interesting story, and it will have some Bigfoot tie-ins as well. But that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed this video and my little stories about the wild men and Bigfoot creatures of the world. And hope you subscribe and come back for more Bigfoot Tales. Until next time, happy squatching.